Welcome to the Art of Healing series of meditations. Today's meditation is taken from the Barefoot book of Buddhist tales, and the passage is called The Foolish Boy. There was once a boy who lived with his poor mother in a small cottage. As the boy grew up, he was found to be rather weak-minded. He was continually getting into trouble because he was so simple. The other children made fun of him by getting him to believe the most outrageous stories. One day he went for a walk in a field full of yellow spring flowers, barefoot, of course, since he had no shoes. He was sitting among the flowers when another boy passed and called to him, "Hey, do you know that the soles of your feet have turned all yellow? That's a sure sign that you're going to die straight away." The poor foolish boy was very frightened, but he thought to himself, "If I'm going to die, then I'll need a grave." So he began digging. Pretty soon he had made a shallow hole. He lay down in it and began waiting to die. Just then, one of the king's servants came by, carrying a big earthenware jar full of oil for the king. He saw the boy lying in the hole and asked him what he was doing. "The soles of my feet have turned yellow, and as you know, that's a sure sign I'm about to die. So I made myself a little grave, and I'm waiting." "That's ridiculous," said the king's servant. "You couldn't talk to me like that if you were dying. Why don't you get out of that hole and do something useful? Look, help me carry this jar full of oil to the king, and in return, I'll give you a hen." So the foolish boy climbed out of the hole, lifted the big jar of oil onto his back, and started off for the palace with the king's servant. As they went along, the boy thought about what he would do with the hen he was going to get. "When the hen lays eggs, I'll let her hatch them," he thought. "I should end up with quite a few chicks. When the chicks grow up into cocks and hens, I'll sell them at the market. Then I'll take the money and buy a cow. Then the cow will have a calf, and I'll sell both the cow and the calf and buy a nice little house. Once I have a house, I'll be able to get married. Then my wife and I will have a baby. When the child grows up, I'll have to make sure that it behaves properly. So if it's good and does what it's told, I'll be very kind to it. But if it's disobedient, I shall be very firm with it and stamp my foot, just like this." And the boy stamped his foot so hard that the jar slipped off his back and smashed to bits on the ground. When the king's servant saw the broken jar and the spilled oil, he lost his temper. "What do you mean by stamping your foot like that and spilling the king's oil?" he screamed. The boy felt he could explain everything, but when he tried, the servant lost patience, took him by the ear, and dragged him off to the king. "Your Majesty, I tried to get this boy to help you carry your oil, but as we were walking along, suddenly he started stamping his foot like a maniac. The jar slipped off his back and broke into 100 pieces." The king asked the boy to explain his behavior. "Well, Your Majesty," he replied, "your servant offered me a hen in payment for carrying the oil. Since I knew I was going to get a hen, it was only natural for me to plan what I would do with it. I quickly figured that by selling the chickens, I would buy a cow, and then the cow I would buy a calf, and then selling the cow and the calf, I could buy a house, and then I could get married and have a child, and I had a plan to raise the child properly. I resolved that if it was disobedient, I would have to be firm with it and stamp my foot to show it meant business." When the king had heard this ridiculous story, he was quite amused. He had a good laugh, gave the boy a gold coin, and told him to go home to his mother. When the boy reached his house, he saw a strange dog sneaking out the front door with a purse full of money in its mouth. He became extremely excited and began shouting to his mother that the dog was running off with her purse. When the mother saw what was happening, she was afraid the boy would attract other people with his cries, and somebody else would chase the dog and get the money. So she ran up onto the roof of the house and sprinkled sugar all over it. Then she called to the boy to come up as quickly as she could. Look, it's been raining sugar on the roof. The boy loved sugar and immediately set to work, gathering it all up. With her son busy in this way, the mother slipped out of the house, quickly found the dog, and got her purse back. Some time later, the boy's mother arranged to marry the boy into a rich family who lived far enough away that they hadn't heard of the youth's simple-mindedness. The custom was for the man to go live with the bride's family. First, the men of the bride's family came to the groom's house for a feast, and then they were to take the groom back home with them, the boy dressed in his best clothes. But when the feast was over, he asked the men from his bride's family to go on ahead, since he wanted to take some time to say goodbye to his mother. As nightfall, at nightfall, he rode off alone by moonlight. As he went, he could see his shadow moving along beside him. He could not see it exactly, but he was afraid it was a ghost or a demon, so he kicked his horse into a gallop to get away. But the faster he went, the faster his shadow went too. He saw he was not going to escape, so he grabbed his hat and threw it hard at the shadow to try to frighten it. That didn't work, so he threw his coat at it too, then his shirt, his trousers, and so on until he didn't have a stitch left on his body. But the shadow was not frightened and continued to follow him closely. Thinking he might slip away, he jumped off his horse and began running along the road on foot. He ran until he reached the shade of a big tree that grew by the side of the road. Once under the tree, he was overjoyed to find that the shadow had disappeared. But as soon as he peeped out from the shadow of the tree, no matter in which direction, the shadow appeared again. This was very upsetting. Finally, the foolish boy decided the safest thing was to stay in the shade of the tree, so he climbed up onto the branches and soon was fast asleep. Some travellers came along the same way some time later. As they approached, they were surprised to find articles of clothing scattered along the road. They gathered them up one by one, and when they found a horse grazing by the roadside, they took that too. They came to the big tree and sat down beneath it to divide up what they had found. Just then the boy woke up and saw what was going on below. So he cried out, "What about me? I want my share too." Hearing the loud voice coming out of the tree, the travellers were frightened out of their wits, thinking that it must be a demon demanding his share. They ran as fast as they could, leaving the clothes and the horse behind. The boy climbed out of the tree, put on his clothes, mounted the horse, and rode off to his bride's house. When he got there, he found he wasn't so very late. The bride's parents led him to a big room where family, friends, and neighbors were waiting to begin the wedding feast. Everyone started to celebrate. There was laughing and singing and lots to eat and drink. The boy was having quite a good time, but he also found he missed his mother. He thought the least he could do was save her some of this excellent food. He found a copper vase with a small mouth and hid it in his lap. As he ate, he kept dropping choice bits into the vase for his mother. He was putting a little cake in the vase very carefully when his hand went in too far and got stuck. He couldn't get it out. This was quite awkward. So with his hand stuck in the vase, he couldn't eat. Everybody noticed he wasn't eating and pressed him to have more, but he just sat there with his hand in his lap, saying he'd had enough, though he was still very hungry. Hours later, the guests left, and the boy was left alone with his bride. She asked him what was the matter with him and why he was acting so strangely. At first, he was too shy to say anything, but finally he had to tell her the story and show her his hand had stuck in the vase. "Oh, that's not such a big problem," she said sweetly. "There's a big white stone at the foot of the stairs. Just beat the vase against the stone and it's bound to break or come off." So the young fellow stole down the stairs in the dark and came to what looked like a big white stone near the bottom of the steps. He crept up to it, raised his arm, put down the copper vase with all his might on the round white object. The vase broke and came off his hand. But to his horror, instead of the clank he expected, he heard an awful groan. Looking closer, he found that what he had hit wasn't a stone at all. It was his white-haired father-in-law, whom he had given a violent blow on the head. The poor man had drunk too much beer at the feast and fallen asleep at the foot of the stairs. Terrified and sure that he had killed him, the boy ran out of the house into the night. After a while, he came to a farm. A large honeycomb had been left in the corner of a farmyard. Not knowing what it was, the boy lay down on it and fell asleep. He was soon smeared all over with honey. In the middle of the night, he grew cold and crawled into a shed where wool was stored. He lay down on that and slept until dawn. When he awoke, he saw in the morning light that he was all white and woolly. Oh no, thought the poor simple boy. As a punishment for killing my father-in-law, I've been turned into a sheep. He was very unhappy, but he ran out of the courtyard and joined a flock of sheep grazing in a nearby hillside. He spent the whole day wandering around with the sheep, trying his best to learn the customs and habits of his new companions. At night, he went with them into the enclosure where they slept. At midnight, some robbers came. They felt around among the sheep, trying to get hold of a nice plump one. The boy was the most meaty, so one of them hoisted him up on his back, and they carried him off to their hideout. They laid him on the ground and were getting ready to cut him up for dinner when the boy became so frightened he forgot he was supposed to be a sheep. He shouted loudly, "Please don't kill me, kind robbers." Hearing a sheep with human speech, the robbers went white with fear and took to their heels. The boy was hungry and exhausted from adventures as a sheep, so he went back to his bride's house. There he found out that the bride's father was not dead, but had only been hurt. When the whole story came out, the poor youth was completely forgiven, and he settled down to live happily with his wife. After some years, he thought he would like to make a bit of money as a trader, so he gathered some things to sell and set off for India. One night on the way, he stopped at a large inn. The innkeeper made the young man comfortable and invited him to his table for dinner. As they ate, the innkeeper told him of all sorts of strange stories. Finally, the young man had to blurt out that he didn't believe him. "To prove I'm telling you the truth, tonight I'll show you something stranger than anything I've told you. I'll bet you when dark falls tonight, a cat will carry a lantern into this room." The young man thought this host's boasting was quite silly, so he said, "All right, I'll bet you anything you like." "Very well," said the innkeeper. "I'll bet everything I have, my house and all, against everything you have, all of your possessions." "Fine," said the young man, quite pleased with himself. "The bet is on." Sure enough, that evening, just at twilight, a large white cat walked into the room carrying a lantern in its mouth. It seems that the innkeeper had spent a long time training him to do this, so it could trick people who stayed in the inn. So the young man had to give everything he had to the innkeeper. He had no choice but to remain at the inn as a servant. After some months, the young man's wife became worried about him. Knowing him as she did, she was afraid he'd got himself into some kind of trouble. She decided to go and see for herself. Disguising herself as a merchant, she took a few loads of wool to sell and set out to follow her husband. Some days later, she arrived at the inn where he was living as a servant. They were very happy to see one another, and the young man told her everything that had happened. She told him to say nothing to the innkeeper and went inside and took a room for the night. As he usually did with his guests, the innkeeper invited her to dinner, and during dinner he managed to make the same bet with her as he'd made with her husband. If the cat came in with a lantern when the night fell the next evening, the innkeeper was to have all her possessions. If not, she was to have all of this. The following day, the wife gave her husband a little box with 3 mice in it and some special instructions. Then she went to sit with the innkeeper to wait for the cat. Just at twilight, the big white cat started across the courtyard with the lantern in its mouth. The husband did what his wife had told him. He let out one of the mice, which ran right in front of the cat. The cat jumped in the air and almost ran after the mouse, but it had been so well trained it regained control of itself. and continued across the courtyard with the lantern. The husband let out another mouse, which also scampered right in front of the cat. The cat was so tempted that it stopped and turned round in a circle 3 times, but still its training held, and it continued towards the doorway with the lantern. When it was just about to open the door, the husband released the last mouse. This time the temptation was too much for the cat. It dropped the lantern and ran off after the mouse. Darkness fell, and the cat never appeared with the lantern. The innkeeper finally had to admit that he had lost his bet. He handed over to the disguised wife not only his own property, but also everything he had won from her husband. The young man and his wife, taking all these possessions with them, returned to their own house, and they lived happily ever after. So, if you want to take a nice deep breath, right down to the base of your spine. And just continue to breathe. Slowly and deeply. In through the nose and out through the mouth. Connecting the tips of the index fingers to the tips of the thumbs. There are many ways to interpret story. But overwhelmingly for me was the love of a wonderful woman. And today, I want us to all acknowledge the love that we have given to others. All the support and care. And sit in the reflection of that love. Allow yourself to feel the support you have given to others. Because you are a wonderful, loving human being. And you deserve every inch of love that you have given. Now is your time to receive. Feel all that love coming your way. Take a nice, long, deep breath. And when you are ready, you may open your eyes. Namaste. Have a beautiful, heartfelt day.